Hari Om, and a very warm welcome to the 6th talk of our series, Swami Venkatesananda Experiences and Lessons. And we're very fortunate. We're going to have tonight our co-spiritual head and co-founder of Ananda Kutya Ashrama, Swami Parvathiananda Mataji, who will be sharing her experiences and lessons with us. And so we look very much forward to her sharing with us. Thank you. Hari Om.
Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Dhyanamulam Guru Murti Puja Mulam Guru Padam, Mantra Mulam Guru Vakhyam, Moksha Mulam Guru Kripa. Om Namah Shivaya Gurave Satchidananda Murtaye Nishpapanchaya Shantaya Niralambaya Tejase. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviyam Karvavahe Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vidvishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om. First of all, to begin with my recollections, I would like to share something about my mother, my mum and dad, because mum was also a spiritual seeker all her life, and she taught us all the right values, and she also had mantra diksha from Swami Venkatesananda, and she used to come to the Perth ashram in the early days and also attended yoga days. And my dad was quite simply an old-fashioned, naturally good man who really just simply loved his family. And the two of them were a wonderful example. When I was 17, I listened to Billy Graham in Perth and was quite influenced by that. Now I was nursing. I think you all knew that I was nursing in West Australia, in Port Hedland, when I came across a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda Paramahamsa. I read it many times, and I can say that it really did begin to wake me up spiritually. I was then 25 years old, and I've still got that copy, which has on the outside cover a cigarette burn, because in those days all of us nurses smoked. Anyway, I enrolled for the Raja Yoga course with the Self-Realization Fellowship, but they never replied, and I felt later that it obviously was meant to be. Eventually I returned to Perth, and together with friends, I drove around Australia for 2 years on a working sightseeing holiday. When I was 29, I read 7 Years in Tibet and also Indira Devi's book, Yoga, the Technique of Health and Happiness, with dear Gloria Swanson in her bathing suit doing the demonstration of all the yoga postures. Yes. Anyway, during that year, myself together with a friend, we started doing Hatha Yoga at the Perth Yoga School. Teachers were Swami Lakshminanda, Brownie John, Vera McCardle, Joy Ferguson. I think also Lionel Drummond was there. Very soon, Swami Lakshmi asked me to teach also. She talked a lot about a Swami who was going to come to Perth soon. But in the meantime, Swami Lakshmi took us on a monthly basis to attend puja to the Venkatesha Murti, which she had in her home in Loch Street in Claremont. And she also had, she also took us at that time, once a month, to a Swami Sangeetananda, who was a disciple of Swami Omkarananda, whose ashram is also in Rishikesh. And we used to get these little tiny books. So that was all very precious and began to consolidate things for me. Then Swami Lakshmi managed to be able to rent an old heritage home in John Street, North Fremantle. And we began to have satsangs there and talks. And I distinctly remember meeting Judy Tobler, who gave a brilliant talk on Gurudev Shivananda. Towards the end of 1971, which is now 50 years ago, Swami Lakshmi took a small group of us to meet Swamiji at the airport. She had told us distinctly that when we saw Swamiji, that we were to prostrate at his feet. Now, I had never done that before, and I must admit that I thought that was a kind of weird thing to do. However, as soon as I saw Swami Venkatesananda, I was just overwhelmed with his energy, his Shakti, I guess, and I found my head on the floor at his feet. It was as if it had been pushed there. And when I stood up, I just had tears in my eyes, and I remember he gave me a big hug. So then, Swamiji gave a series of talks at that old heritage building, and satsangs. It was a wonderful time already, and I think we were all very blessed. So Swamiji at that time also gave 3 talks at the UWA Hackett Hall, University of West Australia, and also at Kingswood College. At that time, also, precisely at that time, was Swami Ranganathananda, who was the head of the Ramakrishna Mission. In Hyderabad in India, also visited Perth, and I had his darshan also. Swamiji was conducting 10-day retreats, I think for several years, and Swamiji gave retreats at what I think was called St. Mary's. It was a high school near Trigg Beach, and 10 days at a time of listening to Swamiji giving lectures and having satsangs. It was just wonderful, and it really consolidated things for me. So, I think it was an Anglican girls' school. So also then we began to learn all the different aspects of yoga, not only Hatha Yoga, but Raja Yoga, Pranayama, aspects of integral yoga, Bhakti Yoga, all that. So, and I remember Swamiji used to conduct 1-hour pranayama sessions, which were really very powerful. During those retreats, as well as normally, but during those retreats, Swamiji just radiated so much. And I remember seeing on several occasions that I saw Swamiji I saw Gurudev superimposed over his head. And that was amazing. So that was that. So these retreats were all very special. Then in 1976, the Shivananda Ashram, Beacon Yoga Center, was opened, and I was amongst the first group of very fortunate residents invited to stay there, along with Janaki, Terry, Andrew, David, Peter Deeg, and a young man called Peter Plummer. I honestly don't know his other name, but he did do a lot towards setting up reticulation at the ashram, and a young girl called Carol. I was very blessed to be given a really excellent camera at that time, and I took all the early photos that were taken at the ashram of everyone, including Dr. Colin Douglas Smith, who became the first president. I'm never on those photos because I took them. I must say that I was just stunned and awed by Swami Lakshmi's hard work ethic, which was copied by all of us. Late at night, Lakshmi would be up on high scaffolding, painting, scraping paint off walls and ceilings. And so all of us got very busy with all that. And of course, there had to be lots of fundraising at that time. And I remember also Alison Salter came over, who really was such an amazing person. Not only did she create those murtis, but the walls, the limestone walls of the Shivananda Ashram are an arm's length thick. And I remember she was standing knee deep in water, replastering those and filling the holes up and replastering those. She worked incredibly hard, as we all did. Anyway, so I was amongst the first ones there, and there was a man called Andre Roux, I think his name was, who donated a printing press to the ashram. And Swami Lakshmi asked if someone would like to volunteer to learn how to print Swamiji's talks books and newsletters. And having been a nurse and not knowing anything about printing, and how it wasn't really quite so easy as I thought, I put my hand up and said, yes, I will learn. So I went to night school and I learned about printing. I printed some of the early little talks books. The first one I think I printed was called Why Meditate, which was very profound. So I lived there for nearly 2 years. And after that, I flew with Swami Venkatesananda to Mauritius. And I arrived there in 1978. And I lived at the ashram of Swami Venkatesananda for 6 months. That was such an incredibly powerful time. Every morning we would see Swamiji performing. First of all, he would recite the Suprabhatam always. We could hear him in his room. Then he would, at 4 a.m., he would perform a puja to Lord Venkatesha on the veranda, and we would all be sitting there. What I observed, and which was such a good lesson, was that Swamiji never wasted any time. And everything he did so wholeheartedly and dedicated it to serving Gurudev, writing his books, researching satsangs. But I'd like to share something that happened to me at the airport. When I was flying with Swami Venkatesananda and Shanti Etches to Mauritius, Swamiji had handed me a very large box, and he said, whatever you do, don't part with this. And so I didn't, until we came to the checkout, And then one of the officials said, oh, you've got to put the box over there and it will go on a conveyor belt. And I said, no, my guru said, I can't let go of this box. Then they said, what's in it? And I honestly didn't know what was in it. So I said, I don't know. No, they said, it's got to go onto the conveyor belt. Just put it over there, it will be fine. By then, Shanti etches also, and everybody was getting quite agitated. I think it was the days before bombs. And so I ended up being quite distraught, and when I had to put the box down. And so I put the box down, and whilst I went through the checkout, I never took my eyes off it, and then it was handed to me. When I finally got outside, Swami Venkatesananda just looked at me with such a stern look, and he said, that is not obedience. Now, there was no way that Swamiji could have seen what I did, because he was outside the building and I was inside the building. So sitting in the back of the car going to the ashram in Mauritius, I think I shed a bucket of tears very quietly to myself. I just sobbed my heart out. When we got there and we got out of the car, Swamiji just turned around and put his arm around me. The next morning, Swamiji called me, and I thought, oh dear, now what's going to happen? And he said, open the box. And inside it were Gurudev's sandals. I could have died. In fact, I think I did 1,000,000 deaths to think that he had entrusted me with Gurudev's sandals. Anyway, that's just a little aside. You know, for me, yoga and all its aspects always, I felt like a duck had taken to water, you know, it was like that. I just loved yoga, all aspects of the teachings. But I realized more and more that it was not easy. So then, whilst we were in Mauritius, Swamiji never wasted any time. He was always busy writing, researching satsangs, and sometimes on a Sunday, we would have 6 to 7 satsangs to attend to in different people's homes. And you always went to the Kabir Mandir also in the afternoon. And of course, people would always be providing Swamiji with food, and it would always be the richest, possibly sometimes unhealthiest food, which was really not good for Swamiji. But anyway, he never disappointed people and ate something of everything. Then it's there I met Praveen and Kamala Ramgulam and Panja and became good friends with them. Then there was the Durga Puja. And this Durga Puja, Swamiji chanted 2 hours with such utter devotion. It was just so beautiful always. And then he would give a talk in the morning and he would repeat it in the evening. So it was just very profound. Anyway, the 6 months in Mauritius flew, since every day we all had jobs to do. And my job was also looking after the garden together with a couple of residents. We all lived at the ashram. From Mauritius, after 6 months, I flew to Cape Town with Swamiji. And I stayed in Upper Orange Street first with Shushila, Swami Sushilananda. And Swamiji suggested to me this would be a good place to settle. I knew nothing about apartheid or anything. Anyway, so whilst I was there, we went up to Johannesburg. We flew to Johannesburg And it had been on my wish list to be able to go to India. And I was sharing a room with Swami Shushila in Johannesburg at Swami Jyotsnamata's ashram, it was then. And one morning, Swamiji knocked on the door and came in and handed me one of his orange jerseys and said, "You'll need this in India because it's very cold there at this time of the year." So that's what happened. I was so blessed to be able to. So now, by the time I had finished everything with Swamiji, it was nearly a year that I was with him every day. But anyway, so now we went to Rishikesh. We flew to India. And no, I did that later, just wait. Swamiji gave, whilst I was in South Africa, Swamiji gave lectures at Mother Yogeshwari's yoga hall in Rosebank. The hall was so packed always. I used to sit in the back on the shoes, on people's shoes. He also talked at a place called the Mitra Hall, where so many people by then had heard of Swami Venkatesananda there. And forget there are many Indian people living in Cape Town, still are, that they would climb on each other's shoulders to be able to listen to Swamiji looking through the windows of the hall. That was such a vibrant time. Then, and that's when I met Mother Yogeshwari. Then I went to Johannesburg, where I stayed at the Shivananda school with Swami Shushila and a whole lot of other people that were there. And that is also where I met Swami Ambikananda. So then we went to India. We flew to India with Swamiji. Swamiji got off in Mumbai and stayed there for a day or two. And we had to meet Swamiji only in Rishikesh. Swami Lakshmi and I flew to either Hardwar or Dehradun, I can't remember, one or the other, where Nandini was waiting with her jeep and the Babaji that she knew, who sat next to her, and she drove the car. She drove the jeep. Swami Lakshmi and I were sitting in the back of the jeep. I had the job of all the suitcases, other people's suitcases, everyone else's suitcases. They were all stacked up to the roof of the jeep. And Swami Lakshmi, who had a sari on, had this enormous pot of dal on the floor. Between her legs, she had to look after it. But you know Indian roads. So Indian roads are full of potholes, gravel, bumps, and so on. So not only did the suitcases keep falling, and I had to pick them up again and hang on to them, but Swami Lakshmi's dal became less and less as it spilled more and more over her lap and onto her sari and everything. And we just packed up with laughter because we just knew this was a test and we just had to go through with this. At some point, there was a wedding and we were not able to go through, and I did not know what the Babaji said, but he stood up and he shouted something, which I think might have been a curse or a threat of a curse. And suddenly the pathway was opened and we were able to drive through, but the people were very angry. Anyway, so then we we finally, late in the evening, arrived in Rishikesh. And it was a semicircular room, and I think there were, I don't think Bill Thomas was in that room, but all the rest of us were there. Janaki from Australia, I think maybe Hamza, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, a whole lot of us were there, and also from other countries. Ray McGiddens was there also. And so now we were there in Rishikesh. That was the most amazing time because all the Swamis were still alive then. Not only Swami Venkatesananda was there, so beautiful. Swami Krishnananda, Swami Madhavananda, Swami Brahmananda, Swami Vidyananda, Sri Narasimhalu, Swami Vimalananda, Swami Chidananda, they were all there at that time. And we listened to different talks at the Forest Academy. It was a daily routine, and at 4 a.m. we met Swamiji at the bank of the Ganges River in the morning, and Swamiji used to go into the river and have a swim. And I must tell you, in January, it's freezing cold, as most of you know, that have been there. And and so we all had to get into the water. And I remember thinking to myself, well, if I've got to die, this is a good place to die. But it was wonderful. We were all in there in the Ganges with Swamiji. And then you get out and you're standing there shivering and shaking, and you have just a small towel, and you have to change all your wet clothes and put dry ones on without showing any part of your body. So we very quickly learned that. And then we would go and have Swamiji's darshan, and he would give us all, and we would have breakfast with him, and then he would give us all jobs to do. Swami Lakshmi always had to go across the river to get special yogurt for Swamiji. I was always sent off to get ginger biscuits, which I think he probably used for prasadam. Anyway, we all were given tasks, and I guess that was so that he could get on with the things he needed to do for an hour or two. And then there were the lectures. So many lectures, and Swami Krishnananda always conducted the early morning meditations. And that routine continued. So it was so intensive because we went from one lecture to another lecture, to a satsang, to listening to Swami Vidyananda. His music, everything. Swami Brahmananda's talks. Then Swamiji had suggested to me, knowing that I was interested, having been a nurse for nearly 20 years, he told me, why don't you go down to see Sri Professor Sri Krishnamacharya and Sri Desikachar in Chennai. And so I caught a train and I went down there and I studied yoga therapy, some basics of Ayurveda, and intensive sessions on pranayama. And I did all that. That was just for a few weeks. So I was there, but I had to be every minute of the day at Desikachar's place, because I had various lectures and things there. Then I was to meet Swami Venkatesananda at the airport in Tirupati. And Swamiji said, why don't you stay at the airport overnight and you can sleep there, and then I'll come and meet you in the morning. Well, that didn't happen because I was not allowed to stay at the airport. I was not allowed to stay at the airport. So I had to stay at a small guest house nearby. So I arrived in Tirupati, and then I saw Swami Venkatesananda on the bus, and he couldn't even sit up. He was lying down and he was yellow, absolutely yellow. Then Lakshmi told me that he had had another heart attack the day before. So then we went to Tirupati. We arrived in Tirupati, and we were given accommodation thanks to Maharani Kumadini Devi. And we stayed for 3 days in Tirupati. Swamiji was so sick. Now he'd had his second heart attack. And he was so sick. People normally would be in ICUs. But what happened was that he gave of himself so unceasingly. Every morning at 3 a.m., we were there for the Suprabhatam chanting, and then the puja to Lord Venkatesha. And so, and I knew that Swamiji was really ill because he was leaning so heavily on me when we were going up and down the steps in Tirupati. And he was so wonderful. He was giving of himself all the time, continuously. Then, after Tirupati, we returned to Chennai. And there is just one little thing that I've missed out, and I think I would like to share that with you. And that is that from Rishikesh, there were 11 of us, including Swami Lakshmi. We took a bus to Uttarkashi, where we met Swami Chaitanyananda, who also later came to Perth. He came to Perth, to Cape Town, I mean, during the Parliament of World Religions. But while we were on that road, sitting in the bus, remembering that the edges of the road are the same width as the wheels of the bus. But I remember looking down and seeing the valleys with the paddy fields and seeing all these beautiful huts and realizing that people lived there, were born there, had their childhood there, got married there, had their children there, worked there, and passed away there without ever knowing anything about the rest of the world. That's just awesome. And I really love that. To think about that. That was so valuable. Our lives today are so complicated. And their lives were so uncluttered. It's a good example for us. Anyway, so now there we were. We returned back to Chennai. And from there, Swamiji came back to South Africa. And he had suggested to me already in Johannesburg, when I was attending the the retreats there, Swamiji had already suggested this Cape Town will be a good place to settle. Like that. Swamiji never told us to do anything. He always suggested it. Then he was very pleased when we did it. So that is what I did. And I started teaching then at Madhya Yogeshwari's Yoga Hall. And a group of friends got together and we had our first meetings, and we were able, with donations, to purchase a piece of land, and the building started. Whilst this was going on, I was teaching at Madhya Yogeshwari's old place, as she was, and I was also teaching yoga therapy to people with asthma and arthritis and so on. And then when Swamiji, the building was completed, and when Swamiji returned in 1982, strangely he reversed his routine. Normally, Swamiji always came to Cape Town first. This time, he came to Johannesburg first. Johannesburg, which has a very high altitude, and that is what caused Swamiji to have his Mahasamadhi there. Nevertheless, right up until the last night, Swamiji gave a lecture. Meanwhile, we did not go to Swamiji's service, memorial service. We did not go to that. But instead, we instinctively felt, Mother Yogeshwari and myself and friends, that we should open the ashram because that is what he would have wished. And so that is what we did. And I think Swamiji must have known that we were going to do that, because with our good friend Rob Featherstone, he had sent down an enormous box of prasadam. So the days before electric fencing and all that, we didn't even have a gate. Land was just open. People just came streaming in for 24 hours. We continually, unceasingly chanted the Maha Mantra. Hundreds of people came and sat with us. And it was just so, the vibrations were so powerful. It was just too wonderful. So that is, I think, there is one little thing that I did not talk about, and I'd like to just mention that at the very end, because it was, whilst we were going around with Swamiji, above Durban is a place called Verulam. Verulam is a small place, and there is a small temple. I believe it's bigger now. Tiny little Lord Venkatesha temple it was in those days when I went there. And there I saw Swamiji doing a puja to Lord Venkatesha. And I must say, how Swamiji did the pujas was always so, like he immersed his whole being into the puja. It's like he offered his whole being into the puja to Lord Venkatesha. He performed the puja. It was so beautiful. And then we were hosted by a family, and I honestly cannot remember their name properly. But what I do remember is that I was sitting next to Swami Venkatesananda, and by then he knew that I not only didn't like chilies, but I couldn't handle them. My body didn't handle them. And so Swamiji got a dessert spoonful of chilies, hot chilies, chopped them up, and then looked at me and said, "Open your mouth." And I opened my mouth and I swallowed them. And I coughed and I spluttered and my nose ran and my ears ran and I was snottering away. And then he gave me a big hug. Well, at least I knew that I'd got past that test of obedience. And he knew that if I would swallow chilies, that I would do many things. Anyway, so, and then we started Ananda Kutia, which now has 2 buildings, and 1 residential and 1 teaching building. And this is all 50 years ago that I went back onto. And being now in my 80th year, as people keep reminding me, not saying I'm 79, but I'm in my 80th year, remembering back 50 years it's a good exercise, I must say. And I would like to thank you all for listening to me and being with me. And it's very precious to have been able to share just a teensy little bit of my experiences with Swami Venkatesananda. Om. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahavyam Karvavahe Tejasvinavaditamastu ma Vidvishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Haram Tat Sat. And thank you all for being there.
Hari Om. And thank you so much, Swami Parvathiananda Mataji, for sharing with us of your experiences. And it's been very wonderful to listen to that. So thank you so much, Swamiji. And yes, we as yet don't have a new speaker for the month of July, but we will inform you as soon as possible. And thank you to everyone who was watching these talks. And God bless you all. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasuma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Mitam Gamaya. Om Shanti 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 Sakravana Ki Jai.